Hi, so my topic was classroom management, and I decided to give my specialty to discipline because I think that as new teachers and some of us just coming out of being students, discipline is one of the hardest things to learn how to do. So, for the first half of the video, I'm going to talk about classroom management, and then I'm going to get into discipline, and then I'm going to end with some tips from my old high school that one of my old professors gave me. And I'm doing this on my laptop, so the video is right next to me, so I keep looking over at it, and I apologize. But what is classroom management? In its definition, it's just a variety of skills and techniques that teachers have to help students learn effectively in the classroom. This could be minimizing disruptions, this could be focusing the students to keep them on task, or it could be the way you organize your classroom. All of this has to do with classroom management. So it's important because if you don't have good classroom management, you really don't have a good classroom. You can't teach your students effectively, and they're not going to learn very effectively either. And that's what you're there to do as a teacher, is to teach them. How you learn it is a little bit more unfortunate. Most teachers don't learn their classroom management unless they go and do it. It's a very common thing where the first few years as a teacher, you're kind of figuring it out and you're learning what works best for you and what works best for your school district and for your students. There's no one right way to go about classroom management. I did break it up a little bit. I want to talk about elementary school, middle schools, which can be grades 6 through 9, it could be 7 through 8, it could be all kinds of, it's the middle grades. And then also high school. And then I have some general things I want to talk about as classrooms in general, as a whole. So in elementary school, one of the most important aspects you can have in creating your classroom management is patience. If you're teaching kindergarten or sometimes even first grade, these students may have never even been in a classroom setting before. They may have not gone to preschool, they may not have been in daycare, and this may be the first time outside of the home without a family member. And that's very hard. And you have to be patient with younger students. They are more temperamental, they're more easily confused or frustrated. It's when they start to learning, that's when they start to learn about what they like and what they don't like. And patience for elementary students. Repetition is also very helpful because they don't always understand you the first time you say something. So you say it over the course of a week, over the course of the month, sometimes several times a day. And because they are younger students, some of them as young as 5 and 6, they will mimic your behaviors. So modeling the behavior you want to see in your classroom is essential for younger students in elementary schools. They will do whatever you do. And if you demonstrate good classroom management and good classroom skills and how to work in school, they're going to do it too. Now, I remember back in kindergarten, all the way up through, I think, 4th or 5th grade, we used to sing songs. And I am going to hold true that those are extremely useful tools. It's a great way for students to remember things. It plays back into the repetition. You can sing songs about literally anything, about cleaning up, about being friends, about working together. So that's one of the classroom management tips I have for elementary students. Now for middle schoolers, this is one of the hardest years that they're going through. They're changing in all of the different ways, socially, sometimes economically, physically, emotionally, and it's when they start to realize who they are, and it's when they start to want their independence. And that's actually where I am observing and participating, is in a middle school that I actually went to. And I do not have a teacher that taught me, but it's very interesting being back at the middle school where I went to middle school. I hated middle school. And to see these students going through the same things I went through, it gives me an entirely new perspective on middle school. And this is the most important thing, is understanding in middle school. Is that if your classroom management doesn't always work, it's going to be okay. The kids are good kids. They're just a little confused. They're very frustrated, especially if you're working with kids who are in remedial classes or education labs, or they have to stay after school for extra help. That's very frustrating to them because they don't fit in with the rest of their peers in a time where social interaction is becoming one of the most important things in their life. So when your students talk in class, yes, it is good to make sure that in classroom management, you have control of the classroom. Just remind them that they shouldn't be doing that, and 9 times out of 10, they'll listen to you. Because sometimes they just get really excited and they want to tell their friend about this new video game they played. Freedom is also very important in addressing middle schools, and you can do this through having them pick their own projects or having work at the door. So picking their own projects, let them learn what they want to learn about. It's going to keep them quiet, it's going to keep them more productive, and they will be learning. And you can thread lesson plans through almost anything is one of the things I've been learning. One of the kids wanted to learn about sharks. Well, he is learning about sharks, but he's also learning about creative writing, and he's also learning about strategic reading skills, and he's learning about opposing viewpoints. So your classroom management can be a little bit more relaxed as long as they're still learning what they have to be learning. And as for having work at the door, have them come in, pick it up, sit down, and start working on it. This is just a general recommendation. No one has to do it. But this way, when the teacher is out of the classroom, the students are in the classroom working, hopefully being quiet, being productive, and learning. This is something a lot of my teachers did. I think it worked very well. My mentor teacher does not do it, but a lot of other teachers I know do it. This also works for high school, which is what I'm going to talk about now, is having work at the door for high schoolers. They will come in and they will start working on it, if nothing else, just because they hope class will end early. Again, you want to increase freedom and autonomy in your lesson plans and in your classroom management, because high school, some of them are learning how to drive, some of them are learning that they can go places without their parents now. They want to hang out with their friends more. And a strange recommendation I have for high school classroom management is stay up to date on slang. And I know that sounds silly, but if you don't know what your students are talking about, they can easily catch you off guard. And if a student catches you off guard, you've already lost the war. I think that all teachers should stay up to date on current social issues, current social slang words, sometimes even memes, depending on what it is. At MCC, we recently just ran into this issue. I know that that's a very strange recommendation for classroom management, but it gives you greater control, I believe, if you know what your students are talking about. So for overall, no matter what grade you're teaching, I think that all teachers should write expectations somewhere on the board. They can just come into class, they can look at the board, and they're like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing today. You can write what's due that day, what warm-up they have due, what homework was due, what homework is due next class, when do you see them next, what do you want to accomplish for the day, having an agenda on the board. This already sets them in focus, it already gives them a plan and a routine, and if you do this every day, they're going to become accustomed to it. School is based on patterns, and that's what we're taught to follow, is patterns. So for classroom management, have your work on the board every day. They're going to know to look for it. Have work as they begin to enter, and something I had not considered actually was respect your students. And I know that I probably should have considered it, but it was brought up to me by one of my old technology professors, was the golden rule in teaching, is if you don't respect your students, they're not going to respect you back. You have to respect their items, their property, and their own feelings, or else they're not going to care about your classroom, your lessons, or what you're trying to teach them. And I think that's common for most people. That makes sense. The most important thing, I say that phrase a lot, the most important thing, for real though, is consistency in everything you do. If in expectations, in work you assign, and in disciplines, which is what I'm going to talk about soon. If you're not consistent in having things up on the board, students won't know what to look for. If you're not consistent in having everything in a certain place in your classroom, they're not going to know what to look for. If you're not consistent in disciplining your students, why should they believe you when they tell you to be quiet and pay attention? I'm learning that teaching is a lot like the real world. But some things I've learned in my placement school in the middle school about classroom management is if you think you have bad students, you're going to have bad students. And I know that sounds pretty self-explanatory, but hear me out here. if you go in thinking, oh, classroom management's awful, none of the students are going to listen to me, I don't know how to teach this lesson, then all of it's going to go wrong and you're going to prove yourself right. It's important that you believe in yourself and that you have conviction and that you have confidence. You are the teacher. You went to school for this. You know what you're doing. You just have to believe in yourself in order to do it. Also, there are many different learning levels in each classroom. In one of the strategic reading classrooms I'm in, I think there is 24 students. 6 of them are almost done with the project we're working on. The middle group is on track. They're where they're supposed to be. And then there's 3 or 4 students that aren't quite on par yet. But they haven't fallen far enough behind to be considered for the reading lab, which is an extra day of reading where help would work. Now, as a teacher, you have to make sure you can address all 24 of those students every single class. You may not be able to do it for as long as you want, even just a brief 30-second check-in, like, hey, how you doing? What have you learned today? What are you working on? Do you have any questions? If you don't meet with every student at least once, they start to fall behind, they start to lose focus, and they start to feel a little neglected, and that's kind of sad. Part of your classroom management is your responsibility to your students to make sure that they learn and that you keep up a healthy learning environment. And if you're not checking in on your students, all of them, and making sure that they're all doing okay, then you're failing at your classroom management. Classroom management is not just standing up there, giving a lesson and yelling at students who misbehave, which is honestly what I thought it was going to be about. It's about checking in with students and making sure that they're okay, and if a student's having a bad day, talk to them about it. Classroom management is for each and every single individual student, just as it is for the entire class. Also, students feed off of each other if there isn't a strong teaching presence. Goes back to confidence. If you're not confident in yourself, the kids won't be confident in you. So now I want to talk about discipline. I'm about halfway through my video now, and the first question I had when I was doing my research is, why would you discipline students? Well, if you don't correct the behavior, it's going to continue. And if it continues, then it's going to disrupt the learning for other students. And if you don't discipline the students, the other students are going to see you a bit wishy-washy. Wishy-washy. If you don't follow up and show authority, then you don't mean business and they don't have to respect you. Now, what requires discipline? My first recommendation is just check with your school district. Some school districts have very strict guidelines. Some have a lot of gray areas. Where I went to school in Penfield, we had a lot of gray areas. So it was up for the teachers to police their own classrooms and decide what was to be disciplined and what was not. Now, of course, there's basic guidelines to any school. Be nice to each other. Be nice to yourself. Don't break anything. No swearing. Don't draw on anything you're not supposed to. Stuff like that. It's pretty basic, normal, everyday, real-world scenarios. But some schools also have more strict guidelines, like if you're at a Catholic school or a different religion school, they might have to do something specific to that religion. Or if they break something that really should not be broken in a rule or a law in that religion. Or if you're in a public school, throw a pencil, not the worst thing you could ever do. Still not great, but it's not horrible. So for major offenses though, like hitting a kid, attacking someone else, I've had a friend of mine throw a desk across the classroom. Usually the teachers don't follow up on that discipline. It's brought to the counselors or to the administration. Now there are so many different methods that you can use to discipline your students. And I'm going to go through them in order of least awful to worst awful, most awful. Calling out a student's name in class. Believe it or not, this is discipline. It draws the attention of everyone else in the class to that student. It can often make them feel very uncomfortable. But you usually only use this when they're talking out of turn, they're not paying attention, or they're doing other work, stuff like that. It's just to redirect them back into the discussion, really. It's less discipline and it is more classroom management to make sure that everyone's participating. Now you can also talk to the student after class if it continues. This is, again, a higher form of discipline because students know that you're talking to them, but they don't know why they're talking to them. And it's this very yes, I'm calling you out, but it's still private, so it's fine. You never want to call out a student publicly in front of other students. I'm just going to go off track here for a second. It's very unprofessional, and it is very disrespectful to the student, regardless of what he may have done. He, she, they, it. Regardless of what the student may have done. Calling a parent, this can be for grades, behavior, or both. Sometimes you call the parent because they stuck gum in another kid's hair, and sometimes you have to call the parent because they're failing your class. You can also give them lunch after school detentions. It's often for repeated offenses. It's usually for something more severe than talking out of turn, unless they do it every class and it's disrupting the class atmosphere. Then it's usually a lunch detention. Now, write-ups are something that no teacher really wants to do, but they are highly required for severe offenses. This is where a student has done something repeatedly, and all of the warnings they were given, they have ignored it, and write-ups are required for the next step, which is ISS or OSS. That stands for in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. It's kind of like detention all day long in school, or you just can't come back for a few days. The students can fall behind on work. They don't get to see their friends. Their parents usually try and murder them. This usually isn't up to the teacher, though. It's usually up to the administration or the counseling system. They often need documented proof, like a write-up or multiple after-school detentions, sometimes even Saturday detentions, if your school district does those. And the most impactive, I suppose, the worst is expulsion. And that's unfortunate. It is the ultimate discipline, and it can either be from behavior or from grades. It's not very common, thankfully, not around here anyway, but it is done in even middle schools and high schools. In elementary schools, it's very rare because normally it's taken to the parents and the parents are talked to. But in middle school and high school, the students start to take responsibility for their actions. And no teacher wants to be the bad guy. And I know that. I don't want to be the bad guy. But you have to discipline your students. Now, there are other methods of discipline, or rather, there's other reasons to discipline your students other than behavior. And this is related to late work. If there's late penalties on essays, homework assignments, readings, journal entries, most teachers put late penalties in place to encourage work being turned in on time. It's most advantageous for the student not to fall behind, and it helps the teacher by not having all of this stuff to grade and then this one essay to grade a week later. That's kind of pointless. You can take off percentages by day, by week, or even by hour. I had a high school teacher who would take off 5% every hour it was late. It's up to you. There's also late arrivals if you come to school late or you arrive to class late. In middle and high school, in my schools, if you arrive late to class, there's something called tardy, Tardy, where you'd have to go to a specific classroom and then sit there, and it was kind of like pretend detention for 40 minutes, and you'd have to sit there and stare at a wall and do nothing, and it was kind of shameful, actually. It worked very well, though. If you were late once and you went to tardy, you really were never late again. Sometimes students just lose half credit for the day, or they lose credit for the amount of time they're on, or the amount of time they're late. You could also have the student come in and spend time with you after school for the amount of time they've missed, but that's a lot of extra work, and I don't recommend that method unless you really have nothing else to do after school and all of your papers are graded. Now, does it work? Of course it works. Discipline is the number one corrective measure we use to do anything in this country, still to this day. In teaching, in life, in anything professional, there's always some kind of reprimand or some kind of mark that's left on your record. It doesn't always work, though. It's not 100% foolproof. Behaviors don't always improve, and that's unfortunate. You don't always have to change your classroom management strategy the minute something doesn't work. It's going to take time, and it's going to take practice. If something doesn't work, okay, you can rethink it, you can go back and you can look at it, but you don't have to scrap the entire lesson plan and start over. That's not what I'm saying. Now, I actually want to talk about something that Penfield uses that was brought up to me in my mentor teaching, called proactive teaching instead of reactive teaching. Basically, you set up your classroom management and you're proactive about it. You work on it very hard. You work with your students. You promote learning as much as you can. And then you avoid outbursts and behaviors that you want to discourage. You don't have to discipline your students 9 times out of 10 because you were proactive about giving them a solid basis to learn from. Reactive teaching is more along the lines of your classroom management's a little bit more shaky. It leads to some disruption in the class, and then you have to discipline your students. You're reacting to your students not acting well versus you're proactively thinking about, okay, how can I keep them engaged? How can I keep them focused? How can I make this interesting for them? Who am I working with today? You work directly with your students, with your classes, and even with the parents of your students. Don't be afraid to call home and ask, hi, I love your student, but we're just not working well together. My mentor teacher had to do that just the other day. She loves working with these students. Excuse me. She loves working with these students, but she can't get through to them. She can't reach them yet. So she called the mother and she asked them, she asked her, she's like, what can I do for your sons? Like, they're wonderful people. They're very respectful. They're just not learning well in my classroom. And I had never heard of a teacher doing that before. And I thought that was really cool that a lot of teachers do it. And that's part of the proactive teaching is that, okay, Tuesday didn't go very well. Call the parent Tuesday afternoon. Proactively teach on Wednesday. How can I make this better for you along with the rest of the class? How can I avoid further conflicts? It's very, very much like defensive driving in driver's ed, where you just try to avoid as many accidents as possible so that they never occur, so that you don't have to pay for them. It's the same idea in teaching, actually, with proactive versus reactive. The teacher implements little tools and tasks all day long to prevent students from acting up in the first place, which, in turn, removes the need for discipline altogether. You can't discipline students if they don't act up. Some of the methods Penfield uses is to keep them on task, calling the parents, don't let the students get bored, being firm in your requirements of the students, and actually keeping high expectations. If the students know that you believe in them, they're going to act a lot better in your classroom. For my final thing I want to talk about in classroom management, it's that your classroom management doesn't have to be just about what's written on the board, and it's not just about what's written in your lesson plan. It's not about checking in with every single student. It's not about getting everything graded and returned to them back immediately, and it's not even about having a really cool warm-up on the desk at the end of the day. It's about making sure your students can learn. As the teacher, it is your obligation to have control over the classroom and to make sure that your students have the best possible chance of learning everything they have to learn from you every single day. And that is a lot of pressure. But classroom management is more of what you do and what you say than anything you could write on a chalkboard or anything you could put on a Post-it note and stick it to the wall. A giant Post-it note. It would have to be a giant Post-it note. But it's something that every new teacher gets better at as they go. We're not going to figure it out the first day. I know the first day I was observing, I was like, nope, I don't know. I do not know what to do now. It's different every year you have students. Not every class is going to be the same. You have to change it a little bit. Every generation is going to be different if you teach long enough. And it is, in my opinion, it's one of the most important topics we're going to be talking about. And I'm not biased just because I had to research it. If you do not have good classroom management, you cannot effectively teach your class. And I don't want to scare anybody either, but I do believe that that is true. So that was my video about classroom management and discipline. I hope that you enjoyed it. I would love for you to ask any and every question you've ever had about this. I will post my resources where I got these underneath in the link below. I had used a lot of different websites, a lot of different books that my teacher gave me, and more than willing to give you those names and publishing companies if you'd like them. And thank you for watching.